Yeah, it might be. Because like, here's something else that I feel like really gaslit on. I used to repeat all the time that
the big reason for people supporting Hamas was because of corruption, I think, and bad like governance from the PLO, because the PLO, as well as being kind of like, you know, the terrorist stuff, was that they were very corrupt. And even then, the split was like, what, 44-43 or 44-42 or something, yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah, maybe. Like, I guess there's obviously a reason that there's never been like a big Mandela-esque leader in Palestine, right? They do have someone who's kind of described as the Mandela of Palestine, but even he's in jail for doing terror attacks in the past. It's just that his language and his rhetoric right now is that he still endorses two-state negotiations.
Yeah.
What can I do for you?
Okay, I'm basically caught up through 2005, and then I know a bit of cursory information around the last 18 years, and the bit that I know as I continue to move through these like final 15 years, I feel like it's gonna push me harder and harder in one direction. Okay, so I'm gonna see if you can pull me back a little bit from this. All right.
Okay.
So here are a few feelings that I have, okay? Just feelings, all right? One feeling is that I think I feel pretty comfortable laying most of the blame for the lack of an Israeli-Palestinian solution at the feet of the Palestinians, namely the PLO, namely Arafat. And I feel like the continuation of conflict, especially between Gaza and Israel, but including the West Bank as well, has like continually been driven by Palestinian terrorism and extremism. And I feel like the Gaza blockade is actually incredibly easy to justify. These are like the feelings that I have right now. I don't know if it's going to change as I dig more into like the particular Gaza wars, but just on the cursory stuff I've read, I feel like it's going to continue to go more heavily in the against that direction. Where do you want to start?
I mean, once Hamas are in, they couldn't really not blockade, because the whole point of the blockade was because they would just take everything they could to make weapons. I don't have a problem with that. As for who's to blame for the peace process not working, basically, are you referring to Oslo or Camp David or?
So Oslo seemed like a good start, and it feels like both sides were making okay progress, even if it was slow. However, so for instance, we got the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, which was really good. We've got Israel in talks with an actual government. I believe we've got even some withdrawals of settlements from the West Bank. So post-Oslo Accords, I feel like we're pretty good. But then it feels like for Camp David, because of mounting both international and internal pressure against Arafat, and the fact that I've seen a ton of statements now from different Palestinian leaders, including like his own widowed wife, that Arafat basically was like planning the second intifada for a while, that when he went to Camp David, it was unlikely that he was ever going to negotiate on anything. That it seems like most, even Arab states, were saying that they couldn't believe the unimaginable deal that was being offered to Palestine at the Camp David Accords, that for Arafat to walk away from that and then for us to walk right into the second intifada feels like a support of the Israeli feeling that Palestinians will only ever settle for a one-state solution, that a two-state solution will never be agreeable, and it has to be like one state. That's what it feels like. Tell me yeah, go ahead.
The thing I think I've mentioned it to you before, that the second intifada idea being planned by Arafat all along, that he was never going to accept anything. I've seen that go around, but I don't think I've ever heard anything conclusive about it. There are statements, but then there are also lots of contradictory statements, but that's the problem with basically all of Camp David. So
well, for
the way I tended to...
let me see if I can find this. Okay. That's how I felt as soon as I started reading them, and I was like, okay, like, is it really planned? But like, so here are some of the people who have made statements. Okay, it's just 2 paragraphs here, and maybe there are other people on the other side. Okay, Support for the idea that Arafat planned the uprising comes from Hamas leader Mahmoud al-Zahar, who said in September of 2010 that when Arafat realized that the Camp David summit in July 2000 would not result in the meeting of all of his demands, he ordered Hamas as well as Fatah and the Aqsa Martyrs Brigade to launch military operations against Israel. Al-Zahar is corroborated by Mossab Hassan Youssef, son of the Hamas founder and leader Sheikh Hassan Youssef, who claims that the Second Intifada was a political maneuver premeditated by Arafat. Now, that guy, to be fair, also was an informant to the IDF. Take that as you will. Youssef claims that Arafat had grown extraordinarily wealthy as the international symbol of victimhood. He wasn't about to surrender that status, taking the responsibility of actually building a functioning society. David Samuels then quotes Mamdouh Nofal, a former military commander of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who supplied more evidence of pre-28 September military preparations. Nafal recounts that Arafat told us, in quotes, told us, now we are going to fight, so we must be ready. And then Arafat's widow, Suha Arafat, reportedly said on Dubai television in December of 2012 that her husband had planned the uprising. And then quoting from her, immediately after the failure of the Camp David negotiations, I met him in Paris upon his return. Camp David had failed, and he said to me, you should remain in Paris. I asked him why, and he said, because I'm going to start an intifada. They want me to betray the Palestinian cause. They want me to give up our principles, and I will not do so. Now, to be fair, she said that happened after the failure of Camp David, but... yeah, and then I feel like I can see reasons why internationally Arafat is being pressured quite a bit. He's lost a lot of popularity in the Arab world. His support of Saddam Hussein after the first Gulf War hurt his image with Palestinians. The PLO was losing prestige. He had already taken a lot of shit basically for saying that, like, we're going to recognize Israel as a country and work with them, even though they hadn't secured any real concessions. So that story makes sense to me. I'm curious, what exists on the other end, or do you remember anything on the other end that's showing that, like, no, actually, Arafat went into that with the best faith possible? Sorry, I'm rambling. Go ahead and talk.
It's just reading through a bunch of, again, this was a while ago, but it's just reading through a bunch of counter statements from different PLO people and people at Camp David, because I think, like you said, it wasn't the idea that he was planning to launch the Second Intifada made after Camp David, right?
I think there are varying reports of, like, pre or post Camp David when he started to plan this. Yeah. And
because
then,
I think the problem was that, like, by 1909, I think that was the deadline for Oslo, wasn't it? Oslo was supposed to be all wrapped up with a final settlement by 1999, but because there had been issues with meetings getting constantly delayed, with Arafat's popularity because of those delays dropping, expansion of settlements continuing, especially under Netanyahu, and also I think just a general dissatisfaction with Camp David itself because the land swaps were unequal, and I think because what else would you say? Like, I can't remember the right of return thing, but I seem to remember one line from Camp David where Arafat and his side want Israel to recognize right of return in principle, and then but taking Israel's demographic concerns into account.
So I think the big disagreement there was, I think Israel was willing to do a little bit of right of return, but they wanted to limit it to 100,000 people.
100,000,
yeah. And then they would donate to a $30 billion international fund to help other Palestinians. But it sounds like Arafat wanted a full right of return for all expelled Palestinians, which at that point would have been, what, 2, 3, 4 million plus? I'm not sure, into Israel proper.
Yeah, because I think I just wonder how much of so I guess the contention was that it wasn't full right of return, like, unconditional though, right? It was supposed to be something that would be like just left open for negotiation over time. Like maybe when things because the way I understood it was it would be as things start to get more peaceful in the future, then they could negotiate maybe for like more return for X number of people in exchange for like allowing like Jewish access to historical sites in the West Bank, like that kind of shit.
Maybe that might be true.
I remember that as part of that negotiation as well was that Ehud Barak's response to one of those offers was something like he wanted some kind of reparation or some kind of like answer for Jewish refugees from the Middle East not getting compensation for their exodus in the Middle East in 48, which I thought would be kind of a weird thing to bring up because one, Palestinians didn't do that, and the other, those refugees had citizenship now. So So yeah, that's why I tend to like, but maybe if I assume everything you say was right, like that, because I know Arafat was definitely like a snake. I don't deny that. Like in the Madrid conference, he basically fucked that by refusing to condemn a terror attack, like a particular one. Sure. Like all he had to do was condemn it. And I know for 100% that when the Second Intifada started, he didn't do anything to try and stop it.
Correct. Yeah.
Even when there were suicide bombings going into Israel.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately with 2000, like so many things that happened around that time that like there was Arafat losing popularity because of his decision to support Saddam in Kuwait, the Oslo Accords running past their set time. I think the Israeli pullout of Lebanon in 2000 definitely changed a lot of Palestinian people's minds because of
Basically encourage them to fight harder, yeah.
Yeah, because the idea is that, well, that happened without negotiating anything, and Hamas loved to repeat that.
Yeah.
So,
which I feel like hurts the idea of a peaceful settlement and reinforces the Israeli idea of the only way the Arabs will respect us is through strength. There can't be these unilateral disengagements. It has to be a negotiated peace like it was with Egypt or Jordan. It can't just be us leaving because we don't get anything from that.
Yeah, and I think, what else was I going to say? I think around that time as well, I wasn't Camp David also. I don't know that much about this, but wasn't the problem with one of the final offer for Camp David also the fact that Palestine would have? There was some legal analyst I remember looking at this saying that it would have basically rendered Palestine less than a sovereign state because of the Israelis wanting to retain a level of control over the airspace and over.
Well, Israel wanted to make sure they had they wanted no heavy arms. They wanted access to water in the West Bank. They wanted 3. I think they argued for 3 radar installations there, and they wanted control over the airspace. Yes, that is true.
Yeah. So I don't know. I can maybe understand why, because I think a majority of Palestinians didn't want that. They supported Arafat's decision to reject it.
While that's true, when I look at what the polling data around the time shows what the majority of the Palestinians want, it seems like what they want is a one-state solution and like nothing less than that. That's what it feels like. That like Camp David was basically dead on arrival.
Maybe, but then I know that during the Second Intifada there were accords like not Taba, but I think Roadmap to Peace and the Geneva Accords, which did actually have a relatively high level of support amongst Palestinians. But then by the time that happened, obviously the Second Intifada had not pushed Israelis to concede more. It actually pushed them to elect Sharon. So, yeah, I think maybe what you're saying is right. Like, I'd have to look into it. Like, because I'm not putting it past him. I'm not putting it past Arafat to plan an Intifada. Because
but then I'm looking
I'd imagine his strategy was because he thought they could just get more concessions from it, which was a terrible idea.
Which is what I heard. When you talk about the land swaps, people were saying at the time that I think Clinton, was it My Life? I think he'd written about some of these negotiations, and I think Clinton had said that when he came in, I'm trying to remember the numbers, but he would have been ecstatic for like a 91% with like 4% land swaps or like mid 90s or whatever. But every time he got a little bit more in the negotiations, his position became stronger and stronger, and eventually, like, even though he was getting land swap deals in the mid 90s, he just wasn't interested. And apparently Clinton made a call to. It wasn't Sadat at the time. It was Muhakabar. What the fuck am I thinking of? Do you know what I'm thinking of? Dictator in Israel before he was.
Mubarak?
Who? Was he the one in power during the Camp David elections? Egyptian dictator.
Egyptian dictator.
Yes.
Is that Mubarak? Hosni Mubarak?
Yeah, Mubarak. Yes.
Yeah.
That like Clinton was calling him to talk to Arafat, and that like the Egyptian leaders seemed to think that like this is obviously a deal that Arafat is going to take. Like, it's insane what's being offered. Like contiguous land of the West Bank. There was an assurance that there'd be like a highway and a train system running between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. That of anything that like they were ever going to get, at the very least as a starting point, this was like an insane deal for the Palestinians. But then it feels like Camp David was like the peak of potential peace, and then from here it just all completely goes to shit.
I noticed that, but don't people also say that Taba was closer than Camp David?
Well, because Camp David didn't actually reach anything. The Taba agreements, I think, is when both sides said that they were closer to peace than they ever had been, but Taba didn't actually pen out anything in actuality as well. And I think by the time the Taba agreement's going to, did the Second Intifada start before the Taba?
Yeah.
And so by then it's because then Sharon wins the next election. And it's at that point.
Nothing to do with it.
Yeah, because the Second Intifada started, which is insane. The Second Intifada is some wild.
Yeah, I don't like, because sometimes people have made the argument that because I think the very beginning of the Second Intifada was spontaneous, as far as I know. It was a riot that was caused because Sharon went to the Temple Mount and declared that Jerusalem is ours and it always will be. So
maybe, yeah, that seems to be debated, but regardless, like, he went there, people got real mad, and then it's basically everything across all of the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza Strip like goes into shit. Yeah.
I know that Camp David was supposed to be the end of all negotiations and demands. Like, that's it, nothing more. So even if, like, I don't know how that works though. Like, in 20 years, can there still not ever be like does the airspace control have to just stay the same forever for like 100 years, or is it something that could be changed later? Yeah.
I think part of the conditions were, I could be wrong, but I thought it was for no more land. I don't know if that meant for every single condition, but that was definitely a part of it, that Israel, once they had settled this agreement with Palestine, wanted to close future talks for, I don't know if it was just land or if it was for all negotiations, but
yeah, I mean, based on obviously what's happened now and in hindsight, like, I think I tend to take the line that Camp David would have been better to accept it, because the result of the Second Intifada was just so much worse than like any concessions that would have had to be made through that.
Sure.
But I need to look a bit more into it though, because I do know that you can also say on the other side that with the Israeli right, that ever since Oslo came in, that they were working their socks off to stop the peace process from ever happening, right? Like with Netanyahu's like crazy speeches and marches against Rabin, or with the fact that they never made any effort to stop settlements, like the right wingers, even when they were out of power, they were still.
I have to check that because that was one thing that surprised me. Was I think under Netanyahu, I thought that they actually, even though he was dragging his feet on the Oslo Accords, I think he actually did pull back on some of them in the West Bank. But
Wye River.
What?
Yeah, the Wye River.
Yeah,
the Wye River.
Yeah, he pulled back on some, but the settlements that did exist, he continued to have those built up. But it wasn't.
I'm pretty sure after 2000, he's kind of admitted that his goal was to sabotage the Oslo Accords, right?
There's been like these things that have been released of him saying as much, which possibly, like, I think there's one recording released where he's like, oh, well, the way that I was going to interpret the Oslo Accords, like, I would basically control the entire Jordanian Valley because it's like militarily important. Whether he could have actually done that or whether he was just like trying to gas his people listening, I'm not sure. But yeah, there are definitely a lot of bad recordings of him, but. It feels like there was it feels like post the Second Intifada, there was a Palestinian leader in Gaza, the Abbas guy. But it seems like after the Second Intifada, like his popularity waned, Hamas takes control. And then at the point that Hamas takes control of Gaza, like, you're basically done at that point there. Like, I don't know what Israel is supposed to do in good faith. After.
Yeah, because people say it was done before then, but I think the problem is that there were still efforts from, even though the Second Intifada was happening, there were still efforts from a lot of Israeli liberals, like sometimes over 50% of the population, were in support of other accords that could have potentially actually led to something as well, like whether it was Geneva, which actually had majority support from Israelis for quite a few years, and I think for 1 year it had majority from Palestinians. But yeah, Sharon wanted nothing to do with it because like that's always been Likud's goal. The way I see it now is that I just see it like the early 90s, the Palestinians gave a massive mandate to Arafat in that first election for a two-state solution. By the end of the 90s, for whatever reason, they stopped to believe in it. And Arafat was, I'm still leaning towards him being a bit of a snake. So,
sure.
And also just like the kind of tragedy of outside events, like definitely the Lebanese pullout was like, the pullout of Lebanon was huge. I could assume that everything you said about that was true, that like Arafat was just kind of backstabbing the whole thing from the very beginning.
Or that like his initial demands were so intense that like there is no Israeli negotiation that allows for a full right of return, which is one of the things I think he was pushing for. Like that would just never, right? Like millions of, But I think the biggest reason why people accuse it of being kind of shitty was apparently like he left these negotiations without making like a strong counteroffer. Like he just like dipped.
And it's also just it just wasn't good to have someone who had spent so much of his life and so much of his leadership position advocating for one state, right? Until like 88. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, bad Palestinian leadership has always been a thing. It's never not been a thing, unfortunately.
Well, I don't know. So this is my issue, okay? And maybe I need to do like a more careful reading of just Palestinian people's history. We say bad Palestinian leadership, but I don't know if it's actually bad Palestinian leadership. Like, it might be Palestinian.
Representative?
Yeah, it might be. Because, like, here's something else that I feel like really gaslit on. I used to repeat all the time that the West Bank Palestinians are not as radical as the Gaza Strip ones, that Hamas is horrible, but, you know, the PLO and the PA are good. That's totally fucking stupid. I'm, like, ashamed that I ever said that. Like, basically every single one of these, like, Palestinian groups have been involved in, like, you know, mass plane hijacking, suicide bombings, mass terror attacks on Israeli civilians, oftentimes in response to IDF violence, to be fair. But, like, internationally, like, I think every single, like, the PLO was involved in a ton of terror attacks on, right, and then also everything with Jordan, everything in Lebanon. Like, yeah, like, all of these groups, all of these Palestinian groups are fucked. And then, like, even in the Gaza Strip, right, Abbas, who is trying to make peace between the Islamic jihadists and Hamas, he lost. He lost those elections, and the Palestinians of Gaza Strip essentially kicked him out. It was like, fucked, and then Hamas wins afterwards, right?
Yeah, I think the reason for Hamas's win is a bit ambiguous, though, because I think most of the exit polls showed from that time that people supporting Hamas wasn't necessarily primarily the violence. It was or even the one-state solution thing. I think there was an exit poll from the 2006 election where people said that they were supporting that like 70+% of them still wanted a two-state solution at that point. It was more that the big reason for people supporting Hamas was because of corruption, I think, and bad like governance from the PLO, because the PLO, as well as being kind of like, you know, the terrorist stuff, was that they were very corrupt. And even then, the split was like, what, 44-43 or 44-42 or something, yeah.
Sure.
So, yeah, maybe. Like, I guess there's obviously a reason that there's never been like a big Mandela-esque leader in Palestine, right? They do have someone who's kind of described as the Mandela of Palestine, but even he's in jail for doing terror attacks in the past. It's just that his language and his rhetoric right now is that he still endorses two-state negotiations.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much I put. Like, I still definitely put some of that on the Israeli right. I think if Sharon had been willing to negotiate throughout the Second Intifada, it was kind of similar to what happened in South Africa, right? Like,
well, but I mean, Sharon, despite him being a conservative, like in the Second Intifada, he announced like the total disengagement of Israeli settlements from the Gaza Strip. No.
Yeah, he did, but before that, he was rejecting every peace negotiation just like on its face, like 3 or 4 of them. He just wouldn't turn up to any of them.
That is true.
And
although
you can say that he's. Yeah. You can say that he's like, justified in doing that because of the Intifada, but because that was his mandate as an elected official. But then I don't know. I guess the problem is that it seemed to be that Israelis still, a lot of them still wanted those negotiations to go through, and it also just historically is that the whole point is that you can't really guarantee an end to the violence until there's a peaceful settlement actually fully agreed upon. That's why, like in South Africa, the violence never stopped right until the first election in '94. And Mandela didn't even really make any guarantee that he could call it off either. So, yeah. What do you think of that? Or were you about to say something else?
What do I think of what? Of him rejecting peace talks? Or?
Yeah.
I mean, he did, but then eventually he started to re-engage with the Abbas guy, Mohammed. What was it?
Mahmoud Abbas.
Mahmoud Abbas. Yeah, he did started to engage with him in peace talks, but it feels like Abbas then started to get sabotaged by the Islamic Jihadist front. I think is it Islamic Jihadist front, and then Hamas, like over and over and over again. Like Abbas would be agreeing to truces with Sharon that Hamas just wouldn't agree to. It's like, no, fuck it, you don't represent us, you fucking piece of shit. And they just continue to rocket, continue to attack Israeli settlements in Gaza, Israel proper, like.
Yeah, and I guess that's why. But I think there's like a bit of a debate about why Sharon went over to disengage from Gaza. If it was a good faith effort to advance peace, it was a really horrible idea, right? Because there was no negotiation. There were no talks
Sure.
to do that. He just did it, and he never really said it had much to do with peace.
Sure. No, I think he might have even said the opposite.
Demographics. Yeah.
But I think he's said as much the opposite. But like I'm seeing is like if you get an Israeli withdrawal, or explain to me why this logic doesn't work. If you get a full Israeli withdrawal of settlements from the Gaza Strip, which Palestinians should ideally want, I think, right? And ideally want in the West Bank, right?
Yeah.
If you get this withdrawal, if that era afterwards is just followed by peaceful, Palestinian National Administration into that territory, and the Gazans just, they live, they do their shit, everything is fine, I feel like that gives the Palestinians a really strong international mandate for forcing Israel out of the West Bank. Because the settlers have finally fucking left. We can have our government now. We can run our shit. Like, fuck it. But for them
the problem is,
go ahead, yeah.
You do it unilaterally, and you've just told every Palestinian that Hamas is basically allowed to make the argument that violence did that, which Hamas did. That was like their big. They had like this. They used to wave these banners that said like 4 years of violence achieved more than 10 years of negotiation. So Hamas just claimed victory for that completely, and that played a big part into them winning their re-election. The other problem is that they took 8,500 settlers out of Gaza in the same year. More than 10,000 settlers went into the West Bank.
Probably, yeah.
So I don't really blame Palestinians for not really seeing that as an effort as like light at the end of the tunnel. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think we can, or I think I would. Like him doing it unilaterally might be shitty. But I feel like at some point in this conflict, like people have to be willing to like make good faith, because right now it feels like the situation is such that each side can infinitely perpetuate violence for some justified reason if they really want to, right? And it's going to take like either historic leaders, so people like Rabin, who are willing to get assassinated, or some like coordinated effort of political parties, whether it's the Israeli Labor Party or the Reformed Fatah, maybe. I don't even know if that's the case. But like there has to be like some show of faith. It can't just be we only speak the language of violence, and as long as people, are getting violenced against, we're the winners. Like it's just like it's unsustainable right now. And I don't know like where, yeah, go ahead.
So I think we probably don't disagree that much on the Israeli side, that the Israeli right have their part to play in stopping like two states and stopping negotiations and all that. When it comes to Palestinians, I guess, do you think like a Mandela-esque Palestinian leader or like a reformed Fatah leader should renounce violence completely?
Yeah, because Abbas, like I think, tried to do that. And I think the Israeli leader Sharon even, I think, agreed to that for a while. But then I think Hamas eventually just started rocketing again. And then we've got like all the conflict from Gaza for the last 15 years. I feel like it's going to take a Palestinian leader, but he has to represent Palestinians that actually want peace, which I don't even know if the Palestinians want that right now. And it has to take an Israeli leader who's willing to look past the infinite amount of violence coming from Gaza, look past the pretty fucked up shit that was going on in the Second Intifada, and like to be able to like break bread with leadership on the other side. Both of those things are pretty hard, but I don't know, like if you're an Israeli citizen and you're like, okay, well, settlements were pulled out of the Gaza Strip, sure, unilaterally, and then they elect Hamas. Hamas basically enjoys support from the population, whether we want to say they're a dictatorship or not. People aren't looking to kick them out. They've been rocketing us constantly. We've done tons of prisoner exchanges. There was that one guy, that one IDF soldier that we traded, like 1,200 soldiers for? Some of which probably participated in October 7th, I'm sure. That as Israel seems to have kind of like made shows of good faith over and over again to the Gaza Strip, it's just like nothing is ever enough. Like, can you imagine if Israel was like, listen, Palestine, you're totally cool. We're going to release the embargoes and everything. You guys can do your shit. Like, if there were massive terror attacks out of Gaza from that point, it would be over for at least the next 30 years for the Palestinians, right? Israel would never forget. I don't even know if they forget the Second Intifada, right?
Yeah, but then the problem is that with military occupation, there's going to be violence of some sorts. I don't think a leader should ever endorse like the attacks on civilians or anything like that. But I think any leader on the Palestinian side needs to harness at least that violent impulse in some way, whether it's like a Mandela-esque sabotage thing or maybe targeting military targets. I don't know. I think that needs to happen. And the problem is that, yeah, you're right. Probably Israelis will never want to negotiate with someone who's like that. I think even leaders who renounce attacks on civilians now, but did it in the past, like I think Barghouti is really popular in Palestine. The Israeli position is just like, we'll just never negotiate with someone like that ever, no matter how much they change, right? So I think that's why there needs to be like an international push, because I think even with the perfect Mandela-esque leader of Palestine, that person is still going to be involved in some level of violence, and whichever movement they lead will still probably do things like they're reprehensible. Which is, again, it's like the ANC made very strong efforts in South Africa to stop the worst excesses of them, but there were still people going around fucking necklacing people and setting them on fire and shit, right up until the end. Mandela's wife was one of those people, right? So I don't know. Do you think Israelis like have a right to reject that kind of position if it came out of Palestine?
Well, in Gaza, I mean, we can talk about like the embargo or the blockade, but there's not technically like a military occupation, right? I don't think there are soldiers with active presence inside the Gaza Strip, but it still just seems to be a source of so much. Like, if you're Israeli, here's a question, I guess. If you're Israeli, do you really think that like giving Gazans like 100% the keys to everything over there, do you think that that's going to lead to a reduction in violence?
No, not right now. It would have to. The only way that I think there can be any advancement is if Palestinians can actually be shown that negotiation and like a good faith effort can actually achieve something. Whereas right now, if Gaza gets just like let open, then it's like Hamas claims victory for that, right?
So then what? So yeah, who leads us? What are we looking for?
That's why I think it just needs to be an international thing. I think Israel needs more pressure from. That's why I've become the American exceptionalist now. It's the only way I can say. It's like Israel needs more pressure from the United States to stop the things that have nothing to do with security and everything to do with making Palestinians more angry, like settlements and the amount of water they allow them and all that shit. And even Palestine, I think America has some role in Palestinian leadership as well, right? Like with what they can allow with what the PA can do as well. So, but the big hole that I've got right now is like, where can Palestinians get that Mandela-esque leader?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Like, or would Palestinians even support that leader right now? Like, what if in Palestine, what if it was the case right now that there isn't support for any sort of two-state solution?
So I don't think two-state or one-state solution is on the cards for a long time anyway. I think it just needs to be something that they can get around, like let's say a freeze on settlements was negotiated by a Palestinian secular leader who denounces attacking civilians, right? I think if that happened, then that could be like a step forward. That's kind of how I view it. Because if they can be shown that, then suddenly I would imagine, like it was in the early 90s, that Hamas would just kind of be a lot less attractive. I think the problem with Palestinians is that they feel like, from their perspective, is that they feel like violence has just achieved more for them than non-violence has. Or
yeah. Huh. Do you think that
that needs to get turned around? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think a negotiated pullout of settlements? Yeah, I guess of settlements in the West Bank, but I don't know. I feel like Netanyahu is not the person to lead that, and I don't know how far. I don't know what the popularity is right now between the left and the right in Israel is. Do you have any idea?
I know it's moving away from Netanyahu, but I think it's moving to the center, not further right. It's just from a combination of like some polls and what people have told me. But again, that this war is going to go on for months. That whatever happens in the next few months is going to change. Is going to determine that ultimately.
Is it though? Because like apparently Israel's gone into Gaza over and over and over and over again and killed like Hamas leadership. Apparently this is like the 7th Gaza-Israeli war. So like, is this actually going to change anything, or is it just going to be a repeat of what's happened?
This is much bigger, right? This is end Hamas forever.
I think it was before too, though, wasn't it? Like I think like some of the first few Israel-Gaza wars were like the goal of destroying all of Hamas leadership, and it did severely weaken them. But maybe I don't know. Maybe it'll be
again. Yeah, they do that and then they leave. Yeah.
Well, but they have to leave. They can't like sit there and occupy militarily, right? Wasn't that the whole point of not doing
Yeah,
that?
but that's why, like, after this, the only way this operation works is if someone occupies Gaza, whether it's Israel or the UN, or someone needs to do it.
But now I feel like we're in an even worse spot than before. Now we've got Israel not only blockading and all that shit to Gaza, but now it's like now it's again a military occupation, which I don't think right now. I think all the weren't most of the IDF pulled back from the West Bank, or are they out there right now? Like, I know they protect like settlements and stuff, but they used to be all over the West Bank. But I think most of that was handed over to the Palestinian Authority, right?
Not most of it. 60% of the West Bank is still controlled by Israel, and Area B is joint control. So it's like 20% of the West Bank is controlled by the
gotcha.
completely.
I need to look at those ABC maps right now, but gotcha.
Yeah. If you look at Palestinian polling for the last 2 or 3 years before this thing happened, the most popular leader amongst Palestinians was Barghouti. He was a Fatah guy who was more popular than Abbas and the Hamas leaders.
Barghouti, I think I remember this guy's name.
Yeah, he's like a really controversial figure because in the second Intifada he did some very horrible shit. He got accused of I think he's in jail now for like multiple murders. But at some point, he has written articles about denouncing any attacks on Israeli civilians. He takes the line of like, this is these actions are unjustified against our future neighbors and all this kind of language, very reconciliatory language, and very. I think he's endorsed the Geneva Accords as late as 2008. So there is some appetite for it there. It's never really, because of what Palestinians have only ever had 2 elections for their leaders, right? Because it's never really had an opportunity to sell itself. And that's kind of what I hope for.
Well, damn.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say before I take off?
No, I'm all good. I'll maybe do more reading about peace process and see if there's anything changes there.
All right, well, hey, listen, I love you, buddy. Be careful, stay safe, and have fun, okay?
Okay.
Love you.
Bye.
Bye. You seem quite willing to criticize the PLO/PA orgs for their passive violence, but don't seem to criticize the IDF and their past violence. I've criticized the IDF quite a bit. I think a lot of this Palestinian and Israeli violence seems to be going back and forth and back and forth. The only issue is it seems like there are points in time where Israel has the political power and like the political consensus to create some sort of lasting peace with the Palestinians, but then the Palestinians just don't have it. They always like want more, or they're not happy with it. Like the Camp David Accord seemed like a massive up. The Hamas election in the Gaza Strip seems like an unbelievable up. Yeah.